hall was quiet except for the sound of chairs being moved. Musicians were unpacking their instruments, tuning strings, and adjusting music stands. The walls carried the kind of silence that comes before something important. Everyone knew. It was audition day. At the front stood the director, a man who had led countless performances. His voice usually carried authority, but today it carried humor. He looked at the young boy sitting by the piano and laughed. The piano itself looked tired, its wood scratched and its keys slightly yellowed. Yet it was still a grand presence in the room, waiting to be played. The boy looked small compared to the heavy instrument. His shoes barely touched the ground from the wooden bench. He kept his hands folded in his lap, eyes lowered as if afraid to meet anyone's gaze. Around him, the adults whispered. Some smiled kindly, others smirked with doubt. They wondered what a child was doing here among trained musicians. The director shook his head and said loudly, "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't cruel, but it was dismissive. They thought of it as a joke, a light moment to ease the tension of the auditions. The boy heard the laughter, and for a second his shoulders sank. But then he straightened. His fingers twitched slightly as if itching to touch the keys. The room carried an odd energy, half expectation, half disbelief. The musicians leaned back in their chairs, curious but not convinced. One of them whispered to another, "He won't even know where middle C is." Another chuckled, "Maybe. He'll just bang the keys for fun." They didn't realize the boy had been listening, and every word fueled the fire inside him. The director gave a little nod, as if to say, "Go ahead then. Let's see." He folded his arms and leaned against the side of the piano, still smiling with disbelief. The boy took a deep breath. His small chest rose and fell slowly. He looked at the piano as though it were not just an instrument, but a friend he had known for years. The air felt heavy. Everyone expected the moment to be quick. Maybe the boy would press a few random keys and then leave. Maybe the audition would end with another laugh. But no one expected silence to stretch the way it did. The boy kept his hands hovering just above the keys, pausing as though he were listening to music only he could hear. Some of the musicians began tapping their fingers impatiently. The director raised his eyebrows. "Any day now," he muttered. Yet in the boy's mind, this was not a game. This was the moment he had dreamed about. The moment when all the nights, spent practicing in secret, all the hours in front of an old community piano, would finally mean something. He closed his eyes. His fingers brushed lightly over the keys, not pressing yet, just feeling the cool surface. A deep breath escaped his lips. He opened his eyes, and for the first time, he looked up. Not at the director, not at the musicians, but at the ceiling, as if he were asking the room itself for permission to begin. The director smirked. "Here we go," he said under his breath. A few more chuckles broke out. The boy ignored them. He had heard laughter before, he had heard worse, but he knew something they did not. He knew what was about to come from the piano, and he trusted it would be enough. The hall grew still. The air thickened. The boy's hands finally landed on the keys, resting gently as though afraid to break them. In that moment, before the first note even sounded, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. And though no one realized it yet, this was the beginning of a story they would never forget. Long before the boy ever stepped into that hall, his life had been shaped by the rhythm of struggle. He grew up in a small neighborhood where the streets were busy, the houses were close, together, and everyone knew each other's names. His family didn't have much. Their apartment was small, the walls thin, and the sound of traffic often drifted in at night. But inside those walls lived a dream much bigger than their space. The light. Boy had always been drawn to sound even as a toddler. He would tap on tables, hum little tunes, or listen closely when a neighbor played music on the radio. His parents noticed how still he would sit, how his eyes would light up whenever a song played, but they didn't have the money to buy instruments or lessons. They could only watch and hope his love for music wouldn't fade. One day, when he was about 6 years old, he wandered into the community center near his home. In the corner of the main hall sat an old upright piano, Its wood was scratched and some keys stuck, but to him, it looked like a treasure. He climbed onto the bench and pressed a key. The sound was not perfect, it was slightly off pitch, but it was magic. From that day on, the piano became his secret world. The staff at the center often saw him there. Sometimes he would sneak in when no one was looking. Sometimes they let him stay, because they could see how serious he was. He never pounded on the keys the way other kids might. Instead, he touched them gently, pressing one note at a time, listening carefully as if the piano were teaching him something. At home, he talked about the piano constantly. His parents wished they could afford lessons, but bills always came first, rent always came first. Groceries always came first, they told him gently. We can't pay for classes right now. He nodded, pretending to understand, but inside he felt a mix of sadness and determination. If no teacher would come, he would teach himself. Every afternoon after school, while other children played outside, he went to the community center. He listened to old recordings on the library's computer. He watched the fingers of pianists on screen, pausing and replaying until he could mimic the movements. He didn't know music theory. He didn't know the names of the chords, but he learned by ear, letting sound guide him. Sometimes, kids from the neighborhood would tease him. They called him the boy with the broken piano, or laughed when he carried a notebook filled with little sketches of black and white keys. But the teasing didn't break him. In fact, it pushed him. The more they laughed, the harder he practiced. He wanted to prove that music didn't belong only to those who could afford it. There were nights when the center closed early. He would press his ear against the piano before leaving, as though he was saying goodbye to a friend. Then he would walk home slowly, hands twitching in the air as if the invisible keys followed him down the street. Even when he lay in bed, he imagined melodies. His pillow became his keyboard, his dreams filled with songs. His parents began to notice the change. They saw the way his face glowed when he spoke of the piano. They noticed his grades improving, his discipline growing. His father once said softly, "That piano has given him hope." And his mother nodded, wiping a tear. Years passed, and the boy grew taller, but his love for the piano stayed the same. By now he could play entire songs, not just random notes. Sometimes people at the center stopped to listen, surprised by the depth of his music. Some even said, "He plays like he's lived 100 years." Though he was still young, his music carried the weight of someone who had seen both struggle and beauty. What amazed people most was that he had never had a formal teacher. His talent came from persistence, from hours of sitting at that old piano while others thought it was useless. The boy didn't just play, he poured his heart into every note. Music became his language, the way he spoke when words weren't enough. And so, by the time he found himself sitting nervously at the audition hall, he wasn't just a boy on a piano bench. He was carrying years of quiet battles, silent practice, and unshakable dreams. He was more prepared than anyone realized. Even though his shoes dangled off the bench and his hands looked small against the wide keyboard, his journey had already taught him something the others in the room didn't know. Music does not measure a person's age or status. It only measures the heart behind the sound. The boy's love for music was clear, but love alone was not enough. The road between his passion and the piano was full of walls that seemed impossible to climb. Every day after finishing his schoolwork, he rushed to the community center, but the old piano was not always waiting for him. Sometimes it was locked inside, and the boy had to press his ear against the wooden door, imagining the sound he longed to make. Other times, other kids would take the bench just to bang on the keys for fun, laughing loudly while he stood in the back, waiting for his turn. He often waited for hours, standing quietly. Sometimes he even cleaned the piano with an old rag, hoping people would take him seriously. But most of the time, the laughter of others followed him. They couldn't understand why a child would spend so much time on something that brought no money, no trophies, no reward. When the boy asked a teacher at school if he could join the music class, the teacher frowned. "Do you have your own instrument at home?" The boy shook his head. The teacher sighed. It might be too difficult without lessons. That was the end of the conversation. The boy was dismissed before he even had a chance, but he refused to quit. He went to the library after school, pulling out old music books. tracing the lines of notes with his finger. He didn't always understand them, but he memorized shapes and tried to connect them to sounds. It was like learning a secret code without a guide. Many nights, he fell, asleep at the table, head resting on books while his fingers twitched in dreams. Sometimes neighbors would hear him humming as he walked home and shake their heads. "That boy wastes his time," they said. "He should be thinking about work, not music." Their words stung, but he carried them like weights on his back, forcing himself to grow stronger. There were darker days, too. Days when the community center was closed for repairs. Days when he had no piano at all. He would draw keyboards in his notebooks, black and white rectangles carefully sketched across lined paper. Then he would tap them with his fingers, pretending the sounds were real. His parents sometimes watched him, torn between sadness and pride. They wished they could give him a better chance, but life had given them limits they could not break. One winter, the boy nearly gave up. The center had been closed for weeks, and he had no place to play. He walked past the locked doors every day, staring at them as though they were keeping his dream prisoner. The snow crunched beneath his shoes. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and his head hung low. It felt like music was slipping away from him. Then, one evening, as he sat at home, he tapped a melody on the edge of the dinner table. His mother looked up from the kitchen and asked softly, "Is that your song?" The boy shrugged, but inside, a spark returned. He realized he didn't need a piano to keep music alive. He carried it with him everywhere, so he practiced on tabletops, on the armrest of the couch, even on his knees while riding the bus. Wherever he was, he imagined the piano beneath his hands. He trained his fingers to move quickly, his ears to catch even the smallest changes in sound. Still, not everyone supported him. Some older kids mocked him directly. "You think you're a musician?" They sneered. "You don't even have a real piano." They laughed as they walked away. The boy clenched his fists, but instead of shouting back, he promised himself that one day they would hear him. One day, the sound of his music would be louder than their laughter. As the years passed, the boy's struggles shaped him. They made him quiet but strong. They taught him patience. They showed him how to wait, how to listen, how to turn even pain into sound. Each setback became another note in the song of his life, and though he was still just a child, something about him carried a weight older than his age. When people finally did stop to listen, they often said, "He plays like someone who has lived through storms." They didn't realize the storms weren't on the outside. They had been inside him all along. By the time the day of the audition came, the boy was not just a hopeful child. He was someone who had been tested again and again, someone who had faced locked doors, mocking voices, and nights of silence. Yet he always came back to the same truth. The piano was his voice, and he would not let anyone take it away. So when he sat in front of the director that morning, shoes dangling, hands folded, heart pounding, it wasn't just nerves. It was the weight of every closed door, every laugh, every rejection, and it was also the fire of every moment he had kept going. They thought they were looking at a small boy with nothing to offer, but in truth they were about to hear the music of survival, the sound of a soul that had refused to quit. The audition hall was alive with chatter. Chairs scraped against the floor as musicians shifted in their seats. The boy sat quietly at the piano bench, his hands folded, his back straight, but his heart racing. He was surrounded by people who had years of training, polished instruments, and confidence that came from experience. He had none of that. He only had his music. The director stood nearby, tall and confident. His eyes scanned the boy from head to toe, and then he smiled. Not kindly, but with disbelief. "If this boy can really play the piano," he announced to the room, "I'll kneel right here." The words floated in the air, and within seconds, laughter erupted. Some laughed loudly, slapping their knees. Others covered their mouths and shook their heads. One musician leaned toward another and whispered, "This will be quick." Another added, "He won't last more than a few seconds." Their voices carried across the room, and the boy heard every word. His ears grew hot. His throat tightened. His hands twitched nervously on his lap. He wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. He was sitting in the center of the room, all eyes on him. Yet even through the laughter, something inside him stayed calm. It wasn't the first time people had doubted him, and it wouldn't be the last. Still, the sound of mockery weighed heavily. It was not just laughter, it was disbelief. It was the kind of laughter that said, "You don't belong here." The boy kept his head low, pretending not to notice, but inside, his chest burned. The director wasn't finished. He smirked, pointing at the piano. "Go ahead, little one, show us what you've got." His words were light, but the room understood the joke. It wasn't an invitation, it was a challenge, a performance set up for failure. The musicians leaned back in their chairs, relaxed, waiting for entertainment. Some crossed their arms, already convinced. Others whispered bets about how long the boy would last before giving up. The sound of their chuckles echoed louder than the silence of the piano. The boy glanced. At the keys they looked endless. Long rows of black and white. He had played them countless times before, but never under the eyes of so many skeptics. His fingers hovered just above the surface, and for a moment, he froze. He thought of the community center piano, the one with the chipped keys and the creaking pedals. He remembered how the neighbors mocked him when he carried his notebook filled with sketches of keyboards. He remembered being turned away from music class at school. All those moments of humiliation came flooding back, and now they gathered in this one room. One of the older musicians leaned toward the director and said with a grin, "Maybe he'll surprise us." The director chuckled. "If he does, I'll keep my promise, but don't hold your breath." More laughter, more smirks. The boy's chest rose and fell as he took a deep breath. He looked up, not at the director, not at the musicians, but straight ahead as if he were staring into an invisible horizon. In his silence, he was gathering strength. He knew something they didn't, that his music had always spoken louder than any word, louder than any laugh. But the mockery did not stop. A voice from the back called out, "Careful, boy, don't break the piano." Another added, "Maybe he's here for fun, not for music." The room roared with laughter again, and the boy gripped the bench tightly. His knuckles turned white, but he did not move. Inside, he repeated to himself, "They don't know me. They don't know what I've lived. They don't know the nights I practiced in silence." His heart thumped against his ribs, but he steadied it with each thought. The director gave a small shrug, almost bored now. "Well, are you going to play or not?" The boy finally lifted his hands. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The laughter softened as people leaned forward, curious to see what he would do. The boy paused again. His silence was not hesitation. It was control. He wanted the moment to be his, not theirs. He wanted to turn their laughter into listening. And slowly the sound of whispers faded, replaced by a strange kind of stillness. The director crossed, his arms half smiling, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. For the first time, the boy had their attention, not by playing, but by holding the silence. It was as though the room itself waited for his decision. The boy's heart slowed. His breathing evened out. His hands lowered gently onto the keys. They were cool against his skin, familiar and welcoming. He pressed down lightly, letting the first note ring. It was soft, but it cut through the silence. The laughter stopped. And though the audience didn't know it yet, that single note marked the end of their jokes and the beginning of something they would never forget. The boy's fingers rested on the keys. His hands were small against the wide piano. But they did not shake anymore. For a moment, the hall was so quiet that even the sound of breathing could be heard. The director leaned on the side of the piano, still smirking, though his eyes followed every small movement. The musicians, who had been laughing only minutes before, now waited, curious to see what would happen next. The boy pressed the first note. It was soft, almost shy, yet it carried through the silence with surprising clarity. A second note followed, then another, each one carefully placed, as if he were laying down stepping stones across a river. At first, some in the room still expected the sound to fall apart. They thought maybe he knew only a few simple notes, maybe a child's tune. but the melody began to unfold in a way no one expected. The boy's hands moved slowly at first. Then with each passing moment they grew bolder. The left hand carried a steady rhythm, while the right hand lifted the melody higher. The sound filled the hall, floating up to the ceiling and echoing back down. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy, but it was real. It was alive. One by one, the whispers stopped, chairs stopped shifting, arms once folded across chests now loosened as listeners leaned forward. Their smirks softened, replaced by quiet surprise. The boy's music was not perfect. Some notes were a little heavy, others a little rushed, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the feeling. Every note carried something raw, something honest, something no one in the room had expected from a boy who looked too small for the bench he sat on. The director's smirk faded, his head tilted slightly as though he was hearing something new. His eyes narrowed, but not with anger, with focus. He no longer looked amused. He looked curious, almost unsettled. The boy, unaware or perhaps not caring, kept playing. His eyes were half closed, his head tilted toward the keys. His body moved with the rhythm, not stiff like a beginner, but flowing like someone who belonged to the music. The melody shifted into something deeper. The boy's fingers danced quickly now, weaving notes together with surprising confidence. It was the kind of playing that revealed more than skill. It revealed a story. The story of hours alone in the community center. The story of nights tapping on tables when no piano was near. The story of carrying laughter and mockery like a heavy stone and turning it into music that could silence a room. A hush fell over the hall. The same people who had bet on his failure were now leaning closer. Their eyes followed his hands as though afraid to blink and miss something. The boy did not notice them anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere only he and the piano existed. The laughter that had cut into him earlier had melted away, replaced by the steady rising strength of his own sound. As the notes climbed higher, the boy's shoulders lifted and fell with emotion. He pressed harder now, not in anger but in release. The piano keys, once strangers, were now an extension of his voice. He told the room everything he could not say with words, his struggles, his longing, his hope. His small frame looked fragile, but the music pouring out was powerful. The director shifted uncomfortably. He remembered his own words. If this boy can play, I'll kneel right here. The laughter that had once made his chest shake now felt distant, out of place. He glanced around the room and saw the faces of his musicians. No longer mocking but transfixed, he looked back at the boy and for the first time saw not a child, but a musician. The boy continued, moving into a softer passage. The notes now sounded like whispers, gentle and tender, as if telling secrets. To the room, several people swallowed hard, feeling emotions they had not expected. The boy, who had walked in shy and silent, now held every person in that hall with nothing but his two hands and an old piano. Minutes passed, though no one noticed the time. The music rose and fell, carrying everyone with it. It was not about perfection, not about polished skill. It was about truth. The kind of truth that cannot be faked. The kind that comes only from someone who has lived through difficulty and chosen not to give up. And then, just as naturally as it had begun, the melody softened again. The boy slowed, his fingers brushing the last few notes gently. The sound lingered, filling the silence before fading into stillness. His hands remained on the keys, his body still. His eyes finally opened, and he looked down, almost shy again, as though he had forgotten there were people watching. For a moment, no one moved. The air felt thick with what had just been shared. A room that had once been filled with laughter and doubt was now quiet, not out of politeness, but out of awe. The boy had done more than play a piano. He had changed the atmosphere. He had made believers out of skeptics, and though he did not know it yet, that first performance would be remembered not for the promise made by the director, but for the way a single boy turned mockery into music and silence into respect. The last notes still floated in the air, delicate but powerful. As they faded into silence, the hall seemed to change. The laughter, the smirks, the whispers, all of it had been washed away by the music. Now there was only stillness, The musicians who had doubted him were leaning forward in their chairs. Some blinked slowly as though waking from a dream. Others held their breath, afraid that moving too soon might break the spell. Their arms, once crossed in disbelief, now rested at their sides. Their faces, once amused, now softened with wonder. The director stood frozen. His arms were no longer crossed. His body leaned slightly closer to the piano. His smirk had vanished completely. In its place was something rare for him. Silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had nothing he could say. The boy lifted his hands from the keys and let them fall gently into his lap. For a moment, he stared at the piano as though he too was surprised at what had just happened. He had played many times before, in the community center, at home tapping on tables, but never like this. Never in a room where every single ear was listening. And yet as he sat there, he didn't feel like a small boy anymore. He didn't feel like someone pretending. He felt like someone who belonged. The piano was no longer just an instrument, it was his voice, and for the first time, people had truly heard it. A soft murmur moved through the hall. It wasn't the laughter of before, but quiet words of awe. One musician whispered, "How is this possible?" Another muttered, "He plays like he's lived a lifetime." Their voices carried a new tone, not doubt, but respect. The director cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room, but his voice cracked slightly. He quickly looked away. Embarrassed, he had promised a joke, but now the joke had turned on him. What stood before him wasn't a child fumbling with keys. It was a musician, pure and true. The boy didn't smile. He didn't look for approval. He simply sat there, calm and steady. His heart was still racing inside his chest, but outwardly he was still. It was as if he knew this moment wasn't about pride or winning. It was about proving to himself that he belonged. Slowly, applause began. At first, just a few claps from the back, hesitant and unsure. Then more joined, until the sound grew, louder, filling the hall with something new. The boy looked up in surprise. His eyes widened. He had expected silence, maybe even more laughter, but applause. That was something he had never imagined. The director remained silent, his eyes locked on the boy. He was a man who had seen countless auditions, countless musicians. Yet this moment unsettled him. It wasn't just the playing. It was the way. It made him feel for years he had judged talent by training, by rules, by technique. But this boy had broken all of that. He had no lessons, no background, no credentials, and yet his music had reached straight into the hearts of everyone present, including his own. It was an awakening for the director. He realized that music was not only about perfection or polished skill, it was about honesty, and honesty was exactly what this boy had delivered. The boy lowered his gaze again, almost shy. He was not used to praise, he wasn't used to being noticed. For so long his music had been his secret, his companion in silence. Now it was out in the open, shared with people who had once laughed at him. It felt strange, but also freeing. The musicians around the room exchanged glances. Some nodded slowly, acknowledging what they had just witnessed. Others smiled, no longer in mockery but in quiet admiration. In that moment they weren't professionals, and he wasn't just a child. They were equals, bound together by sound. The director finally spoke. His voice was lower now, almost hesitant. "Play again," he said softly. The boy looked up, unsure if he had heard correctly. The director repeated, stronger this time, "Play again." And so the boy placed his hands back on the keys. This time there was no laughter to fight, no smirks to ignore, only silence waiting to be filled. He began to play once more, and the hall leaned in, hungry for every note. The second performance was different. It was lighter, freer, as though the boy now understood the power of what he carried. He no longer played only for himself. He played for everyone in the room, sharing his heart openly, and as the notes rose again, something in the director's chest stirred. He thought back to his own childhood, to the time when he first fell in love with music before rules and discipline turned it into work. He realized he had forgotten that feeling. This boy, with nothing but raw determination, had brought it back to him. The director felt his throat tighten. He didn't kneel, not yet, but for the first time in years he felt humbled. When the boy finished a second time, the room erupted in applause, louder than before. It wasn't polite, it wasn't forced, it was genuine. People clapped with open hands and open hearts. Some even stood unable to hold back their admiration. The boy sat still, overwhelmed. He had never asked for applause, never imagined it, but now it wrapped around him like a warm embrace. For the first time, he wasn't the boy who didn't belong. He wasn't the child mocked for dreaming. He was a musician, and though he didn't fully understand it, this was the beginning of something far greater than an audition. This was the awakening, not only for him but for everyone who had doubted, laughed, or dismissed him. The hall was alive with applause. The sound echoed off the walls, bouncing back like a wave that refused to end. The boy sat on the bench, stunned. His small hands rested in his lap, his shoulders still rising and falling from the effort of playing. He had expected silence, maybe pity, maybe even more laughter, but applause? He had never dreamed of this. The director remained standing at the front. His hands hung loosely by his sides. His face no longer carried a smile, not even the faint smirk he often wore. Instead, his expression was caught somewhere between disbelief and humility. He had laughed the loudest when the boy first walked in. He had promised a bold joke, a statement made only for laughter. Now that promise stood in the air like a shadow, waiting for him to honor it. The musicians glanced at him, some with curious smiles, others with quiet nods. They hadn't forgotten his words, and neither had he. If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here. That sentence replayed in his head, loud and heavy. He had said it as a joke, but the boy's music had erased all sense of comedy. The boy looked down at his shoes, almost embarrassed by the clapping. He wasn't thinking about promises or challenges. He was simply grateful that his music had been heard. His heart swelled with quiet pride, not for the applause itself, but because for the first time, people saw him for who he truly was. The director took a slow breath. His chest tightened. He felt the weight of the room pressing on him. He knew every eye was watching, waiting to see what he would do. He could walk away, pretend he had never said those words. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about respect. He stepped forward, each footstep echoing across the floor. The musicians fell silent. The applause slowly faded into whispers. The boy lifted his head, unsure what was happening. The director stopped just beside the piano. His face was solemn, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Then slowly, he lowered himself down to one knee. The hall gasped. No one had expected it. The director, who had laughed so confidently, now bent down before the very boy he had mocked. It was not dramatic, not loud, but it was powerful. It was the kind of gesture that needed no words. The boy's eyes widened. He didn't fully understand why the director knelt, but he could feel the weight of the moment. His chest grew tight, and for a second he thought he might cry. He quickly blinked the feeling away, choosing instead to sit straighter on the bench. The musicians watched in silence. Some of them exchanged glances, but most kept their eyes fixed on the boy. They were not looking at the director's kneeling form, they were looking at the reason for it. The boy had done what no one else could. He had turned doubt into belief. The director finally spoke. His voice was softer than usual, almost heavy. "You've earned this," he said simply. The words were few, but they carried more weight than any speech. They were words of respect, words of surrender, words that admitted he had been wrong. For the boy, this was more than victory. It was not about proving the director wrong. It was not about winning over the laughter. It was about something deeper. It was about knowing that his long nights, his silent practices, his stubborn refusal to quit, all of it had led to this moment. Applause rose again, louder this time, mixed with cheers. The boy looked around, still overwhelmed. He felt the sound wrap around him like a warm blanket. It was not just applause, it was acceptance, it was proof that he belonged. The director stood slowly, brushing his knees as he rose, but he didn't hide from the room. He let them see his humility. He let them see his change. For years, he had believed talent came only from training, from structure, from discipline. But today, a child had shown him something he had forgotten, that true music lives in the heart first. The boy gave a small nod of gratitude, not a smile, not a boast, just a quiet acknowledgement. It was his way of saying thank you, his way of accepting what had just happened, without needing to speak a word. That moment would stay in the memory of everyone present. The director kneeling was not just a gesture, it was a symbol. It was a reminder that talent can rise from anywhere, even the most unlikely places. And more than that, it was a reminder that respect must always follow truth. The boy left the piano bench that day not as the child who walked in nervously, but as a musician who had earned his place. He carried himself taller, not because of pride, but because he finally believed in his own worth, and the director, humbled and changed, would never again look at music or at people the same way. The applause finally faded, replaced by a silence that carried more weight than noise ever could. The boy stepped down from the bench, his shoes tapping lightly on the wooden floor. His heart was still racing, but now it beat with a different rhythm. Not of fear, but of pride. The director stood tall once more, but he was not the same man who had mocked minutes before. His eyes were softer, his voice quieter. His shoulders no longer carried the arrogance of certainty. Instead, they carried the humility of someone who had learned a lesson the hard way. He gave the boy one last nod, a gesture of respect, and stepped aside. The musicians began packing, their instruments slowly, but their eyes lingered on the boy. Some smiled at him as he passed, small gestures of approval, quiet acknowledgments of what they had witnessed. They knew they had been part of something rare, something they would tell others about for years to come. The boy walked toward the door, but he paused for a moment and looked back at the piano. It sat in the center of the hall, still and silent, yet it felt alive to him. That piano had given him a voice. It had turned his silence into sound, his struggles into strength. It wasn't just wood and strings anymore, it was a partner in his journey. As he stepped outside, the air felt fresh. The sunlight touched his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment, taking it in. The world outside was the same as it had been when he entered. Busy streets, tired buildings, the hum of everyday life. But something inside him had changed. He no longer carried the weight of doubt alone. He carried proof. For the boy, this day was not the end of his story, but the beginning. The audition hall had been just one stop in his journey, but it was the place where he had transformed in the eyes of others, and perhaps even in the eyes of himself. He now knew that music could take him further than he ever dreamed. The director, too, carried something away from that hall. That night, as he sat alone, he thought about the boy's playing. He thought about the way the music had reached him, cutting through his pride and defenses. For years, he had measured talent by tradition, by rules, by polished skill. But the boy had reminded him of something pure, that true music doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't care about status. It simply speaks. And so, the director began to change. Slowly, but surely, he softened his approach. He looked for heart as much as he looked for skill. He encouraged students to find their own voices, not just follow instructions. In his own quiet way, he carried the boy's lesson forward. For the musicians who had laughed, the day remained unforgettable. They had entered the hall expecting entertainment at the boy's expense. Instead, they had been humbled. They now told the story to others. About the day a child walked in, sat down at the piano, and silenced an entire room. Some told it with wonder, others with embarrassment, but always with respect. And the boy, he continued to play. Not for applause, not for recognition, but because music was part of him. It was his way of breathing, his way of surviving. His journey was far from easy, but every time he sat at a piano, he remembered that hall, that audience, and the moment when laughter turned into silence. He learned something that day, something that stayed with him forever. People will doubt, people will laugh, people will question, but sound cannot lie. Music cannot be mocked when it is true, and truth always finds a way to be heard. Years later, when people asked him about his first big performance, he never mentioned the laughter or the mockery. He spoke instead about the silence that followed his last note. That silence, heavy and filled with respect, was more valuable than any trophy. The story of that day spread far and wide. It was retold not only as the tale of a talented boy, but as a reminder of something deeper. That greatness can rise from the most unexpected places. That humility is stronger than pride. That one voice, no matter how small, can move an entire room. And so the boy's music became more than a performance. It became a message that said, never judge too quickly, never laugh too easily, and never forget that talent like light can shine anywhere. The hall eventually returned to its ordinary routine. Musicians came and went, rehearsals filled the air, but the memory of that day lingered within its walls as though the piano itself remembered. The director, the musicians, the boy, they all carried it in different ways. But together they had shared something unforgettable. And long after the applause faded, long after the laughter was forgotten, one truth remained clear. A boy with nothing but determination had walked into a hall full of doubt and walked out with respect, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest echoes.